So I'm pleased to welcome here Antonella Ghignoli, who is full professor in University of Rome, Sapienza. She's a specialist of diplomatics and paleography. She studied in the University of Pisa, of Firenze, of Leipzig, and in the École Française de Rome. Why not? She is the principal investigator of the ERC Advanced Grant Notae, not a written word, but graphic symbols. Very nice acronym, in fact, dedicated to the study of graphic symbols from late antiquity to early medieval Europe. She is a very known scholar in the field of diplomatics. She published a lot of books, and especially she's the editor of this extraordinary series, not very known in in Belgium or in France, but it has to be, because I think it's a masterpiece of a series dedicated to diplomatics. This one is dedicated to forgery, so you do understand that it's quite pleases me. So this series Italia Regia, she is a specialist of study of charters, of rulers especially, but not only, of literacy from 7th to 12th century, but also she studied, let's say, late Middle Ages diplomatics, medieval notaries. She edited a lot of sources, of medieval sources, so she is an accomplished scholar. And she published a lot of books. I won't enumerate all of them. You have just to check their extraordinary academia account. So you'll see that she published the Inventario dei Libri di Celio Calcagni. She published some charters, le carte archivescovile di Pisa, i brevi del comune e del popoli di Pisa, and so on, so on. My Italian is absolutely ugly, but you'll forgive me. I hope so. So it's a great pleasure to welcome here Antonella for a paper which will introduce all the French-speaking community to the extraordinary work you are doing with all your projects. And I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. Bonjour à tous, à toutes et tous. Et je voudrais parler peu en français. Je suis très honorée et aussi très ravie d'être ici. Thank you very much, Paul, for your kind presentation. And I'm going to share my presentation, and I'm going to begin this talk with you. Thank you very much. Do you see something? It's all okay? Okay. From the 3rd to 8th century, some historical phenomena can be studied in continuity. Documentary practice is certainly one of these. The basic textual frame of the barbarian documents is recognizable as a part of a Roman discourse. And this fact is a fundamental evidence for the derivation of the early medieval documentary practice in the West from the later Roman world. At the same time, however, this same fact constitutes the main obstacle to our understanding the process of derivation in all its aspects. I will not follow long-term developments of specific documentary typologies today. Rather, I will discuss a mode of written communication connected to a particular need. The need to represent a sequence of things within a written record. This need emerges as a constant in the whole documentary tradition of the period in questions, regardless of questions concerning the longue durée. For reflection on the need On the need to write a list, a classic starting point remains Jack Goody, the chapter 5 of the Domestication of the Savage Mind. In my lecture, divided in 4 points, I would like to attempt to reflect on the possibility of framing significant features in the practice of writing a list within the rich transmission of the documentary papyri of late Roman and Byzantine Egypt. The aim is to assemble a minimal number of critical elements useful for comparative analysis of similar practice attested in the very poor transmission of documentary sources in the later Roman and post-Roman West. The specific goal, in fact, is to interpret a 6th century Latin documentary papyrus, so far unknown, so far unpublished, which has recently been added to the group of papyri from Italy and which is a fragmentary list, or better, a fragment containing a list. The term list, catalog, table, index are currently words of scientific terminology in fields ranging from information science to lexicography and computational linguistics. The same can be said for the words catalog and inventory, employed respectively in the fields of library science and archival science as technical terms. The specificity of all these terms in each field, however, is somehow based on the meaning they have in everyday language. In Italian, both the words elenco and lista imply the idea of a certain intrinsic order, meaning a series of items. The same is in the definition of Verzeichnis and Liste in German, whereas in French the term list seems to convey the idea of an order, but with regard to the external written structure of the series of names or things rather than to the internal one. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a list is a catalogue or roll consisting and so on. And a catalogue is a list, register or complete enumeration, and this is and so on. The Italian term catalogo means a list is not only systematic but also ordered. In English, the concept of order is apparently implied in the definition of table. As regards the term inventory, the first and proper meaning of the word in English is related to semantic area of the inheritance law, from which it derives its figurative meaning of a detailed account, and thus its use as a synonym of list and catalog. Instead, in Italian, inventario is a written list in which all the objects in a given place at a given time are systematically and accurately described. As regards the term register, both in Italian and in English, it refers primarily to a book or a volume in which important items are recorded. And also in index in English is an alphabetical list in a book, and the word indice in Italian has the same meaning. When dealing with a large number of late antique documentary papyri, list and inventory, more rarely catalog, register, or index, are the words usually employed to describe and classify any text consisting of a sequence of words or groups of words that are written next to each other and not necessarily connected to each other syntactically. A multitude of such texts survive from late antiquity and early Middle Ages. The choice of an appropriate modern term to define them is possible only when we can define or guess at the circumstances of creation of the document and at its function with a certain degree of plausibility. It is often impossible a priori to establish the origin and the function of a list. Indeed, even when it is theoretically possible, this is not easy. The issue of the choice of a modern word might arise, on the other hand, by translating ancient terms present in the text of a documentary papyrus, whenever the context and experience of the papyrologist suggested that they mean a written text structured more or less as a sequence of items. Also in this circumstance, the choice of a definition from the range of different modern terms available, as we have seen, depends on our understanding of the nature and function of the document cited in the papyrus. Searching the English definitions we have seen before in the database of words in Greek papyrological text by Trismegistos is an interesting experiment, as you can see, that illustrates this sort of hermeneutic cycle at work. In late antiquity and early medieval documentary sources, the item more frequently listed separately or in combination are personal names, place names, role names, names of objects and animals, and numerals. Numerals expressing dates or amounts of something, for example, money, goods, or livestock. In some cases, the item of a list consists in a phrase or phrases without verbal elements in the vast majority of cases. It happens when a scribe has to list, for instance, books, documents, or textiles. We have good reason to think that the scribe, in this case, designed the order of words in a way he considered adequate for his purpose. Since the purpose of a list is often the unknown factor in criticism, in historical criticism, from which the criticism itself depends, the textual structure of the item in a written sequence arranged as a list has all the value of a primary source for the historians. In a recent anthology, this papyrus aus Leipzig is defined a list of journal followed by endorsement. But what we observe on the recto is a stratification of three texts arranged one below the other in a unique column, written by three different hands for a total of 22 lines. It is actually a sort of a collaborative text. It starts as a sort of a cover letter accompanying the delivery of 4 official journals and ends up becoming the proof of the delivery itself. In the first text, anagraphe, the cover letter, provenance, nature, and purpose are clearly stated. Philiskos, strategos of Mendes, is expressly declared the sender of some official journals that are to be stored in the record office of the Alexandria city district Patrika. It closes with a date. The second text is a statement by the person who materially brought the journals from the office of the Strategos to the Patrika archive, presumably an autograph, and written immediately upon delivery. The third text is the Acknowledgement of Receipt, written in the Patrika archive in the name of the bibliophilax, the keeper of the archive. It attests that the 4 rolls entered in the archive on 15 April Anno Domini 136. The former cover letter was returned to the sender as a proof of delivery for preservation in his archive, and this can be deduced by analyzing the structure of the short text written on the verso from another hand 4, when hand 4 summarized the document. The dorsal note is a sequence of 3 elements you can see here, and the key element is the first one. When we analyze it as a primary source, it shows us that the note was written from the point of view of the former sender of the cover letter, and it communicates the information needed to manage that written record effectively in the archive of the Strategos Philiskos, the sender, who can therefore be considered the final recipient of the papyrus. The first text contains a section that serves to communicate the material transferred from Mendes to Patrica. And this is actually structured as a short list, which starts after the phrase AZ de, near the end of line 5, immediately after the presentation of the sender. And it ends at line 12, before the dating formula. It consists of 4 items plus a summation in line 12. The 4 items have each 2 elements. The first element offers precise chronological information, and it is structured in the format from, to, apo, eos, with the addition of the conjunction and, kai, before the second, the third, and the fourth items in a manner equivalent to the modern semicolon. The second element indicates the precise number of rows in each instance. The summation that concludes this list indicates the total number of rows. The fact that the second item starts and ends on the same single line, line 7, is apparently random. In conclusion, the list is communicated without the need for an arrangement different from that of the previous portion of the text. It might perhaps be explained by assuming that the list was not the core for the scribe of the first text, and that he knew in advance that the main function of that papyrus sheet was to receive the acknowledgements of both delivery and receipt, the second and the third text, and that its final destination as a completed document would be the same as its origin. Another sample of a list transmitted without breaking the normal text alignment is in the writing frame is this papyrus from Berlin. The list begins at line 2, since line 1 contains the dating formula and the word veterani, which introduces the series of names of veterans residing in Alexandria. Alexandrini is an addition above the line 1. The names are written one after another on the same line. The text has blank spaces, you can see here, which separate one item from the next. Since all of the text is a pure sequence of names, apart from the first line, we cannot exclude that the possibility that the blank space performs here its usual function as marker of major pauses within a paragraph. This papyrus, Papyrus Sarkon 1, is a fiscal declaration preserved intact, dated, and written in Greek with the subscription of the author in Latin. Within the text of the declaration, in technical and apographe, there is a portion indicating the personal names of the taxpayers and the amounts of taxes. This portion is arranged in a tabular format in the modern sense of the term. The writing lines from line 7 to line 15 are actual rows, that is, horizontal sections in which various information relating to the same person is organized so that all the elements of the same kind for different persons are aligned in the same column. The tabular format gives to this portion of the document, and only in this case, a visual dimension which is lacking in the samples we have seen before. There is no reason to think that the tabular format was not deliberately designed for this purpose. In other words, it is clear that the textual scheme of the table was applied for its functionality, as it was a well-known practice used in the administrative and fiscal sphere. The papyrus we now cite as Carte Latine Antiquiores 43, 1248, you see here, is a short liber epistolarum set up by the Roman soldier Sarapio after his discharge from the army, so as to collect the copies exempla of 3 letters issued by the higher competent authorities attesting his career steps and therefore his veteran status. The third letter here deals with the dismissal of a group of matriculae, among whom figures the decurio Serapio. In this case too, the tabular format seems to serve effectively the purpose of communicating the relevant information in the case. It is arranged in a careful manner, 4 columns, here 1, 2, 3, 4, for role, name, reason of dismissal, and salary, and 11 rows, 1, there is the 11 rows, 1 for each soldier. In the first row appears the name of Sarapio as decurio, according to the role indicated in the first column, who was discharged because collicus. There is no reason to think that the text of this dossier are not relatively exact transcriptions of the original letters received by Sarapio. And this also true also with regard to their layout, especially at crucial points such as that in letter 3, where the list of soldiers discharged is announced here, et sunt. Therefore, it seems reasonable to suppose that what we now see at that point of the copy was the same in the original letter. And moreover, we can assume that the original letter at that point contained in all likelihood an appropriate excerpt from the official military rolls where discharges were recorded in tables. A table can be read in several directions, following one's own index finger or a stick, in vertical fashion from top to bottom and vice versa, and horizontally, not necessarily from right to left. On occasion, multi-directional reading generates within the same textual structure several different lists, which can be as many as the columns and rows. For instance, one may scroll the third column, here, the third column of the excerpt of the table of discharged soldier copied in letter 3 of Serapio, and then read a list of diseases or impediments to the status of the Roman soldier. Collicus, debilis, senex, egrotus, senex, ut supra. Collicus, debilis, senex, ut supra, ut supra. The fact that the phrase ut supra replaces an item is noteworthy, for it directs the reader's eyes upwards within the same column and to the item written on the line above. One can easily assume that the use of tables is connected with highly organized milieu, such as the fiscal or military administration of the Roman state. For instance, it seems frequent in documentary practice of the military administration the use of a single column tables, in other words, lists in the modern sense of the term, where each line corresponds to one item and each item is written in a vertical series, one below the other. The edition of the Latin papyri from Dura Europos offered by Robert Marichal in 4 volumes of the Carte Latine Antiquores represents a model in studying similar forms of written records. It includes a long introduction which provides a masterly survey of paleographical and diplomatic aspects of the military roles as documents in the form of lists. Specific graphic signs, points, lines, layout, in most cases designed in a single long columns, and the dynamics of written registration. For example, writing of the main text and writing additional correction later into the main text, all are significant features because they served the pragmatic purposes for which this particular type of document was created. Specific signs and layout were conceived to manage the written lists. This global punctuation system, on the one hand, represents the document's grammar of use as variation of the grammar of legibility of parts. On the other hand, it is constitutive of the document itself. All the same, further critical comparative analysis of all the evidence are needed, although there is a new publication on military documents published by Ornella Salati recently. Moreover, the relationships between the external form and the formulae of the laterculi and the form of list of the documents produced by military administration is a topic currently being discussed by epigraphers. It seems likely that the laterculi somehow reflect the form of the documents produced by the Roman military bureaucracy. The word laterculum was used in the meaning of list from the 4th century onwards, mainly in the military milieu, and it is adopted by the editors of the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum to indicate those Latin epigraphic monuments erected by soldiers on occasion of their discharge. Nearly all preserved documentary papyri are fragments or of rolls or codices. Rarely can we read a document in its original whole. This loss of text has a different impact and variable extensions according to the material support on which the text was written, papyrus, parchment, wood, stone, and the type of medium used to transmit the document, roll or codex, single sheet, single piece of stone, bound tablets. The writing material and type of support employed make a fragment different. Whereas writing material is evident, the medium has to be inferred, and this makes it even harder to identify the lost original form of a document that is now preserved as a fragment showing only a sequence of words. The definition of a fragment as a list, inventory, catalog is given in the first instance on the basis of the internal organization of the surviving text as a sequence of elements, so that it is normal and it is inevitable to classify it as a list in the context of an edition. In the context of research and study, however, we need to verify at the outset that what in fragment appears to be a list really does represent a type of a document distinct from others, for example, from a letter or a contract, and therefore ought to be classified as such. This procedure might cause distortion on several levels, and it might do so specifically as regards the possibility of hypothesizing an original rule, and in general as regards the possibility of investigating the existence, uses, and circulation of textual patterns that arguably originated in particular spheres of documentary practice, where the list might instead be properly considered a peculiar form of documentation. The more documents that are preserved relatively intact, the more feasible it will be to classify the list in fragments. Increasingly well-studied areas and documentary typologies will facilitate immensely our interpretation of them. This is a well-known basic rule of the critical method. Let's imagine for a moment that all the text of the Papyrus Sacron 1 around the central portion containing the table had been lost. Probably even so, it would be not difficult to recognize it is a fragment of a fiscal declaration of the 4th century for the content of the items, and for the fact that this typology are preserved for the period and this typology is well studied. Nevertheless, a significant quantity of fragments will continue to maintain their appearance of pure and simple lists or inventories for a variety of reasons. Unknown provenance of the papyrus, no significant elements allowing the papyrus to be dated with relative precision, at least 2 centuries, no significant papyrological data, and no significant textual elements that could make it possible to guess the medium and the context of its origin. In order to contribute to a minimal evidential basis for future investigation, in such cases we can detect and describe significant external features according to the terminology of paleography and diplomatics, which have traditionally been concerned only with Latin text on papyrus and parchment of the Latin West and the Greek text from Byzantium, but which are not so common among papyrologists. This open or can open the possibility for scholars dealing with problematic fragments to engage in critical comparison and historical argumentation even at minimal levels. It may help to identify those lists which in some way have a formal appearance among that large but heterogeneous group of private notes, lists, and memoranda, to cite the conclusion of Bernard Palme. In actual practice, there are not many elements available for such analysis. Some of them have already been illustrated and indirectly before. Arrangement of the text on the papyrus sheet, alignment, punctuation marks in the sense of any kind of graphic science employed both to organize the writing of the items within the writing frame and to manage the list later at the moment of its possible use. Presence and position of possible graphic or Christian symbols. Handwriting in terms of an ascertainment whether the hand is individual or chancery bureaucratic, whether the writing is cursive or accurate calligraphic, that is in terms of an evaluation of a significant common criteria both in Greek and in Latin documentary tradition of the period as indicated by Guglielmo Cavallo. And finally, presence of a sort of heading, definition, title, which is perhaps the unique internal feature useful for a comparison. It happens, for instance, that edition omit to indicate the presence of graphic Christian symbol. In the edition of this papyrus from Wien, a Bevölkerungsliste, dated 6th-7th century from Hermopolis, arranged in one column in which each line corresponds to each item of the list, we learn that the sequence is opened by a staurogram only thanks to the printed reproduction. By contrast, the editors of the short collections called O Kyrios Liste note about one of them, this papyrus, dated 5th-6th century, that the Chrismon am Anfang und am Ende stellen sicher, dass die Liste vollständig ist. It is a noteworthy remark because it is based on the assumption that a graphic Christian symbol, in this case is not a chrismon, is a stylized staurogram, may have also a distinctive function, as punctuation signs in a short text of 5 lines. This assumption is totally reasonable, but it still has to be proved by collecting similar cases and comparing related practices. A further instance of the presence of Christian graphic symbols in a list is offered by a fragment of unknown provenance, but probably from Byzantine Egypt, which dates to the 6th century, is preserved in the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden in the collection von Scherling, and it has been published as a list of documents. As the editor notes, it is apparently the beginning of a list of letters. The beginning is marked by a staurogram. What is also noteworthy is the well-arranged alignment of the verbal items of the list. Please note in particular the point on line 4 from which the scribe starts to write the text, which belongs to the second item of the list, and the position in ecthesis of the first word of each item, chirographon. It is expressed in the monogrammatic abbreviation chi-ro for this word, and as such it seems to perform here to the distinctive and thus punctuative function of initial signs of an item. Finally, there is another interesting feature in this papyrus. It should be noticed, the presence of a sort of title, of a sort of definition, which serves to communicate the list. Gnosis grammaton ge, it is not completed. The practice of introducing a list with a definition title preceded by a staurogram is attested, for instance, in this papyrus. Please note that in this fragment, a hand traced the line ending with a thick point on the left side of the sheet, near the start point of each writing lines corresponding to each item of the list. They could be signs drawn by writing the list as punctuation marks, for instance, or more likely, in my opinion, by reading and using later the list, as, for example, marks in a verification procedure. Gnosis, the word gnosis, isolated or followed by a genitive as a specification of the listed object, has a parallel in the Latin notitia, which is attested both followed by the genitive notitia testium, for instance, in the practice of Ravenna, or followed by de and the ablative notitia de caseos, notitia de pecora, attested in Ostraca from Vandal Africa or in the Pizarras from Visigothic Spain. Notitia emerges in scattered but significant Western documentary sources of the same period, 6th, 8th century, as a title for similar documents in which it is clear that the list is the core of the text and that the function of the document is the written communication of a series of things. In a paper I am preparing in these weeks, I suggest the hypothesis that gnosis and notitia were expressions in different language of a similar and common documentary practice spread in the late Roman state. In the Italian papyri, also the term brevis, which is mainly used to indicate an official return, appears with the meaning of list, perhaps because reports often contained informations organized in lists or tables. And the same practice continues into the 8th century in Lombard Italy. All the same, the word brebion in the meaning of list or inventory appears also in documentary papyri of Egypt ranging from the 4th century to the 7th. In particular, brebion sometimes appears as a title at the beginning of a text having the form of the list. Without gnosis, was the most widespread term as a heading for list from 5th century Anno Domini onwards. And now, Papyrus Vicenza, the new Latin documentary papyrus containing a list. This papyrus, not included among the Latin documentary papyri from Italy edited by Jan Olof Tscheder, this papyrus was discovered or rediscovered in 2001 in a drawer of the Civic Museums of Vicenza, a city of Italy, of course. Announced to the scientific community some years later, it was presented and discussed for the first time on the occasion of a conference in Sevilla. The fragment is currently hosted by the Istituto Papirologico Girolamo Vitelli in Florence, where it has been restored and it is waiting to be returned to the museums of Vicenza. An edition of the papyrus and commentary are forthcoming in a publication authored by myself, Teresa De Robertis, and Stefano Zamponi, which will be published in the editorial series of the Istituto Vitelli. The current width may not be so different from the original one. You can see here these fragments, this big fragment of papyrus. The papyrus is badly damaged, in particular on the left and right edges, and the lower edge seems to have been cut clean. Moreover, there are 3 holes in the middle of the sheet, and many fibers have been removed on the upper side. There are 22 lines of text written across the fibers preserved, but the first 2 of these are almost completely illegible. There is no visible collesis, and the verso is blank. The Latin text is written in a fluent Nouvelle Écriture Commune, according to the definition of Jean Malone, that is in the script commonly known as the later Roman cursive. On paleographic grounds, it dates to the 6th century and probably to a period no later than the 7th decade of the century. The mention of Curiales Panormitani at line 18, it is not sufficient to prove the Sicilian provenance of the papyrus, but it does demonstrate its Italian provenance and confirms the impression gained from the paleographical analysis. The fragment contains the final part of a list, arranged in 1 column, wherein each writing line corresponds to 1 item in the list. The list consists of 22 items. Each item contains the summary of the content of the document or a description of documentary material. It is clear that the list was originally designed to be composed of 2 different sections from 2 elements. The presence of or absence of a numeral at the beginning of the text string of the item and the textual structure of the item. In the first section, which includes the first 20 lines corresponding to the first 20 items, there is a numeral at the beginning of the line. It is followed by a blank space before the beginning of the text of the item, which consists of the summary, more or less detailed, of a written documentary record. The last item you see here, the transcription, the last item is here, is marked by the numeral 25. Since the lines preserved and marked by legible or illegible numeral are 20, we can be certain that the upper part of the fragment contained at least a further 5 lines containing the first 5 items of the list. The second section can be observed in the last 2 lines corresponding to the last 2 items. There is no numeral at the beginning here, but an evident blank space, so that the beginning of the text of the first items fall exactly under the starting point of the text of the last item of the first section placed on the line above. The same happens for the second and last item. The result is that the items of this second section are perfectly aligned with the ones placed above belonging to the first section. An elegant here, distinctive in terms of size, initial letter F of the first word of these items, the word is fasciculus, marks the beginning of the 2 final items. In both instances, the text consists of the vague description, or so it seems, of documentary material. As we have seen, investigating the text appearing to have the form of a list involves some peculiar difficulties in addition to the usual ones encountered in editing documentary papyri. The original context, the function, and sometimes the content itself are nearly always a matter of guesswork. The hands that wrote them nearly always remain unknown, and the same can be said about their recipients and the purposes for which those texts were created. And this is true even in the case of documentary papyri from Greco-Roman and late Antiquity Egypt, where it is easier to suggest institutional or personal contexts, despite or thanks to the fact that the evidence consists of thousands of fragments. Therefore, in this research context, it is possible to investigate a text preserved in formal list, taking into account the external elements, the external features I have illustrated before. The situation is completely different for the late Antique West, where the number of documentary papyri is extremely limited. Among the 59 Latin documentary papyri edited by Cheder, only 6 fragments contain a list. The fragments, the papyri 1, 3, and 4 of this list do not help for comparison to understand Papyrus Vicenza, because their lists are basically in tabular format. In all 3 cases, fiscal matters and management of landed properties are involved directly or indirectly. And in all 3 cases, it is very likely that the scribe took the tables from a register that was produced and held either by offices or by private landowner and existed in the form of a roll or codex. Thus, they must be approached via a critical comparison with the use of tables and similar schemes attested in documentary papyri from Egypt and somehow related to the various Roman administrative milieu. Papyrus Italy 15 does not help either. It is a beautiful example of the continuity of the list in notizia shape I have mentioned before. It is a list of holy hoils brought from the tombs of martyrs in Rome to the Lombard queen Theodelinda in Monza by a certain Johannes in the time of Pope Gregory the Greek. Only Papyri Italy 47-48 and Papyri Italy 53 present a structure similar to that of Papyrus Vicenza in two important aspects. The list is arranged in one column where each item is written one below another in a single writing line. The writing line is relatively long as regards the width of the papyrus sheet because items consist of relatively long text strings. Papyrus Italy 53 cannot tell us any more than that because it is a fragment, a real fragment in which only 4 very badly damaged lines are preserved. And because this list has 4 items and they are description of ecclesiastical textiles that probably belonged to a church in northern Italy. Papyrus Italy 4748 instead is helpful in investigating Papyrus Vicenza, but only because of the fact that 42 of the 44 preserved items are summaries of the content of documents, exactly like Papyrus Vicenza. We can compare the structure of the summary in both cases in order to frame a possibly widespread use in summarizing documentary records. As a result, it is possible to identify constants or variables by comparing syntax and terminology and taking into account the stage of the documentary Latin in 6th century. For example, for these 2 items, respectively from Papyrus Vicenza and from Papyrus Italy 4748. But the Papyrus Italy 4748 consists of 2 different fragments, fragment A and fragment B, preserved in 2 different places. They were not originally contiguous, but probably belonged to the same role. Thus, but this papyrus is a very, very problematic source. In his edition, Cheder entitled the document Inventa eines Archives, but in his dense commentary, he explained that this piece is very problematic and there is no possible to define it as an ordinary inventory. The original context, function, and nature of this text remain an unresolved problem. Perhaps only one fact is certain, that the documents listed in this papyrus seem somehow connected to the administrative activity either of the Arcarius or the Prefectus Praetorio per Italiam or of his official. Comparing the textual structure of the items of Papyrus Vicenza and Papyrus Italy 47 and 48 is important, but not sufficient for the main issue that both sources raise. The first, how was the text string of each item written? Was it composed by the scribe of the list or by the person dictating, by reading the documents he had to list and summarize, or was it composed by copying the docket already attached to the documents or the dorsal note written on the verso? This is not a philological issue, pure and simple. It is a question of our being able to capture the viewpoint of the author of these microtexts and consequently to suggest a provenance for the document listed in order to form a hypothesis about the provenance and the destination of the list itself. The Italian documentary papyri did not preserve any dorsal notes on the verso, except 2 dorsal notes containing few legible words in Papyrus Italy 35 and 37, both unpublished. And this can be explained by the consideration that none of them is preserved entire. The only Latin example we have are preserved in the Tablette Albertini, where Latin dorsal notes summarizing the Latin X contained on the polyptych's interior surface so that a comparison with the structure of this text is possible. Dorsal notes are well attested instead in the documentary tradition of the later Roman Egypt, and what we learn from the analysis of their scribes' point of view, as we have seen, is decisive in the same way as the notes on the Tablet Albertini. The first section of the list in Papyrus Vicenza is characterized, as we have seen, by the presence of a numeral at the beginning of each line. Both fragments of Papyrus Italy 47, 48 are damaged on the left side. All the same, it is unlikely that this space was sufficient to host both the necessary free area before the beginning of the writing and the space for a numeral. Therefore, this feature, the presence of a numeral, represents a hapax within the Western late antique documentary tradition in the Latin language, and Papyrus Vicenza is a unicum from this point of view. It is true that it is necessary to ascertain whether numbered lists comparable with Papyrus Vicenza are preserved among Greek papyri fragments from the late Roman Egypt, and the examination of the sources is still ongoing. Nevertheless, from the list preserved in that documentary tradition, we learn that if a list serves as a written steps in procedures employed by a particularly well-organized milieu, then it is more likely to include as a final item an indication of the amount of the listed objects. In view of this, the series of numeral in the first section of Papyrus Vicenza is an economical system, successful system to communicate immediately an amount without adding a further line to the list. Last of all, and I'm going to conclude, another external feature of Papyrus Vicenza has not yet been mentioned, but it is equally characteristic and important: the presence of two Christian graphic symbols. The first staurogram is drawn at the end of line 20, containing the last item of the first section of the list. It is written in ligature with the final letter T or the final word of the item, ement. The second one is drawn at the end of line 22, containing the last item preserved of the second section of the list. Also in this case, the graphic symbols is written ligature with the final letter R or the final word of the item, quatuor. Thanks to the evidence of the documentary papyri of later Roman Egypt, which attest the use of such graphic symbols as sign to mark the end of a textual unit, we can assume the same function for the staurograms of Papyrus Vicenza, and we can conclude that what we have called first and second sections of the list were both actually considered by the scribe as completed and therefore closed parts of the text. Along the lower edge of the fragment, there are remains of a lost written line. Two visible small traces, both are traces of a vertical stroke. The first trace is placed almost at the beginning of the edge, exactly in correspondence of the cipher 5 of the numeral 25 above, on the third last line of the fragment. The second trace is placed under the letter A of the word quatuor in the last line of the fragment. This means that the list preserved in Papyrus Vicenza is a part of a whole. And what kind of document it was, where, when, how, and why it was written are entirely matters of guesswork, for which only an extensive and complex commentary can provide the necessary basis through the painstaking exposition of clues and arguments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Je pense que voilà, on peut tous.
Merci.
We can thank you a lot. Sorry, I was just switching to French, but I'll go on English. Even if we are all here, practically everyone is French speaking. But anyway, I've begun speaking English. I'll try to end to follow my first impulse. So. It's a wonderful paper. Thank you so much for this for this wonderful presentation. It was very important because I think you presented here not only the question of the list, which is by itself essential. It has a lot been studied in for the Western Middle Ages by some scholars, as in French-speaking area, Pierre Chastan and all his team, but it has not been studied in the same way and with a very wide point of view for the non-Western area and for the non-parchment documents. And so it was very important for us, I think, to present this this point of view, this huge landscape, this huge view of the list. But it was important for the list. It was also important for the papyri, because I don't think that in our courses of studies, we diplomatists or paleographists or scholars have a lot insisted until now in Europe on the importance of papyri, and especially not only of, I mean, the traditional Egyptian papyri for the pharaoh time, of course, but the Greek papyri and the North African papyri, the Eastern papyri, all these papyri from which are so important, which are which are countless practically for the end of the Roman times and the beginning of, let's say, the end of the Roman time, let's say. And so it's an all different world which is now open for us, and the specialists of papyrology have opened a huge way, a huge new tracks for us to study, and it's very important that you presented us this kind of documents, because it gives us a complete different perspective about our own kept documents for the end of the late antique empire and the beginning of medieval times. It's a completely different view. I think it was from a pedagogical point of view, it was very important. I have several questions, specific questions, but just before asking you, giving you this list of questions, another list of questions, I will ask the people in the audience if they want to intervene and ask questions to you about your paper. I mean, don't hesitate to take the word. If you want just to prepare, I'll begin with a specific question. You spoke about list on papyri, but what about list on ostraca?
Yes, in ostraca there is notizia. There two or one ostraca edited by Rodney Alst in Heidelberg. Of the 6th century Vandal Africa, so early Middle Ages, Notizia de Pecoras, and then a list of a list in but list probably is a document. Notizia, so it's difficult for me today to explain, but in the same period where gnosis, grammaton, gnosis, and so on are widespread in the part of the late Roman state in Greek language, there is the practice of notizia de or notizia testium notizia as a need to, probably is related to the official document or to the leges, imperial leges that have at the end a gnosis or notizia as a list of the important things published in the text of the norm of the lex or the lex. Osaka, among the Osaka there are almost 2 cases. They are very rare, but also in the Pizarras. Okay. And of course, the layout is very different. Is the support, the material support that that determines the layout, but.
And just speaking about other supports, about different how to say that, material support. You have, of course, papyri, you have ostraca. Do you have something like for this kind of documentation for the Roman, late Roman times and in Greek areas? Do you have documents written and specifically documentary list and so on let's say parchment or skin? Or specific skin?
In Lombard Italy, there is a lot of parchment breve demoniminas, or yes, also, right. I think, for example, the single columns list from San Martin of Tours, of the Thuringia area. So their layout is as a lot of things as to do with the practice of the late administrative areas of the late Roman states. It is not it is not studies, but from if we see this the documentary practice in its all of the 5th, 6th, 7th century, also from the from east. Towards the poor transmission of the West, we have another impression. It's very interesting. It was very interesting for me. I discovered a lot of things, or a lot of ideas that I cannot imagine. So
yes, of course.
Of course, there is no we must pay attention not to be naive but there is space to do research and to see possible lines. Of course, so it's a challenge, and for me was interesting from the methodological point of view. We have few sources, and we have a lot of incertitudes, but it is an important space for the historical method for me. And perhaps you can see that also in this paper, the theme of fragmentary, the theme of comparison, the theme of and the occasion was this list or list, a fragment which contains a list. I don't know if it was a letter, official letter, or a document containing a list, but the typology was that of the document, not the list as a typology in itself.
Right, right. I think that was another very important point. The idea that the list is not extant by itself, but it has to be to live inside another text, and it's included. So the idea that does it mean that we are lacking something? We are lacking something if we are missing something. If we are just trying to study the concept of list by itself, just as Goody said, the idea of some kind of essential list from yes, if you see what I mean. Is it necessary to study the list, but every time inside a huge, a larger context and inside a text?
Yes, and this list belonged to an advanced society where literacy was so widespread, and this is the difference with the early Middle Ages, and where probably some typology same typologies remain but isolated as a practice which continues but without this need to accept from Ravenna or Rome, for example, but for a limited time.
Definitely. If someone has something to say, something to add, or something to ask, don't hesitate. Nicolas.
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation. Maybe I'm very naive. I don't know at all this corpus, so I wanted to know: do you see some specific characteristics of this subcorpus of lists on papyri compared to the whole corpus of papyri? Do you see any particular chronology for the lists compared to the whole papyri thing, or any particular provenance? And how many of the papyri contain lists?
So a lot, thousands. So lists in the late antique corpus of papyri from Egypt are very, very, a large quantity. So my focus was, of course, I presented some cases from 3rd, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, but the focus was on 5th and 6th century Byzantine Egypt and the West, where we have nothing, but we have traces of exchange, continuous exchange, economic and political, military from East and West, Ostrogothic Italy or Byzantine Italy. And so list in a space, so in the corpus of papyri from Egypt are thousands, because there are thousands of fragments, and the list is also a part of a document like the first I presented, a document that has nothing to do with the list. List of journal followed by endorsement. It was another document containing the need to a list of journal delivered. It was an example to show that the need to write a sequence of things is everywhere, especially in a society like the late Roman state or the late Roman Empire, where the literacy, the need of writings were widespread, and from of which we have really the Uberrest, the remains. I doubt there are thousands of fragments and lists.
Okay, and please, I wanted also to know, thank you for this answer. Do you see any influence of the Christian mind on the way lists were made?
No, I don't. It's difficult because the papyri came from Egypt. Egypt is a stratification of uses, demotic, and then Greek, Roman and Greek, Coptic. So I see the introduction of these graphic Christian symbols as the point of start, so as punctuation signs at the beginning of a text that I can define list. The example of the 5th and 6th century starogram, the title, heading, gnosis or notizia, and then a column or with a sequence of things. So these documents may I define lists, and in this typology I can see some features that and the graphic Christian, graphic symbol, Christian symbol at the beginning, but it was the same use also at the beginning of a private letter, Christian letter from Oxyrhynchus, the document, letter, epistles, or the documents itself. And from this use derives the use in the West, or the invocation at the beginning of the documents, of the early medieval documents, whose archetype is the ancient epistle. So the letter in the later Roman state, the document as the form of a letter, hierographon, or a letter in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Right.
It's difficult to speak in English and not in my language, or not in your language.
But
I would like to be an apostle with
you say, you can speak in Italian, and especially with Emily.
Yes. May I ask my question in Italian? So it's easier for you.
Yes.
Grazie, professoressa Ghignoli.
No, professoressa no.
Vabbè. Comunque, guardando alcuni documenti che lei ci ha fatto vedere, ero particolarmente colpita da questa lista di veterani in cui la successione in lista, la separazione fra gli elementi della lista è fatta dagli spazi bianchi, un po' come delle moderne tabulazioni in qualche modo, e poi diciamo questa soluzione che è familiare a tutti noi della lista in colonna. Mi chiedevo, cioè non so se anche si può studiare, ma se può esserci in qualche modo una relazione anche sul modo di leggere questi documenti, dal fatto che il diverso layout implica un diverso modo di lettura globale in qualche modo dell'occhio, del modo di apprendere, come viene troppe lingue, di cogliere in un modo sia sequenziale sia unitario diversi elementi, quindi di individuare più facilmente gli elementi della lista, perché appunto si sanno delle cose sulla lettura declamata però di testi letterari, e non so assolutamente se questi documenti facevano l'oggetto di una lettura silenziosa oppure a voce alta, e quindi se secondo lei, non so, ci può essere una riflessione da condurre sul modo in cui veniva impaginata la lista e il modo in cui questa veniva letta in senso largo.
È una buona domanda. Non so, questi sono documenti pratici, pragmatic, erano in mano ai soldati, tutti leggevano, i soldati forse più il greco, il latino era amministrativo. Il lungo dossier compilato dal soldato Sarapio sono copie di lettere che quel soldato si è copiato in un lungo dossier per avere la sua documentazione di status di veterano. Quel papiro un pochino antico che ho fatto vedere con gli spazi bianchi l'ho indicato un po' a fini narrativi retorici, per indicare che si possono fare elenchi di cose o persone in modi diversi, ma un po' anche per questa cosa degli spazi bianchi, e adesso spiego perché. Noi che ci siamo formati alla paleografia, alla diplomatica medievale, anche andando verso l'alto medioevo, per noi è un concetto comune, quasi comune. Io l'ho imparato da quella bella monografia di Malcolm Beckwith Parks, Pose and Effect, no? Tutta impostata sui libri. E in quella monografia Parks indica lo spazio bianco come momento di pausa. Tra gli studiosi dei documenti su papiro, anche dell'alto medioevo, diciamo orientale o della tarda antichità, questi concetti legati al layout, alla punctuation system non sono conosciuti e sono introdotti soltanto di recente come una novità. C'è un grande studioso francese, Jean-Luc Fournet, del Collège de France, che ha fatto un importante lavoro intitolato per una paleographie signifiante, notando nelle lettere dell'Egitto bizantino, nella loro disposizione di aspetti, facendo notare delle cose che per un diplomatista o per un paleografo anche dei documenti sono cose molto, molto comuni. Le lettere allungate per la reverenza, disposizione del testo. Allora, quegli spazi bianchi indicano, danno anche all'occhio a chi legge l'idea un nome, un spazio, un altro, quindi separano. E io l'ho fatto apposta per introdurre, anche per chi leggerà questo paper ed è il più abituato a lavorare sui papiri ed è un papirologo, questi concetti che sono di buon senso, sono quasi un po' storici, non ho una risposta. Si nota questo, come si nota però che nell'ambito militare e amministrativo fiscale c'è questo uso molto raffinato della tabella e delle tables o in colonne. Probabilmente tutti i rotoli, i ruoli della gestione militare erano in questo modo. Costituivano i documenti amministrativi con cui questo Stato enorme andava avanti, aveva registrato ogni cosa. Quindi non so, non so dirle, però sono cose da notare perché non vengono notate. I papirologi sono più attenti a decifrare il papiro, a interpretarlo, e sono lavori molto difficili, e a cogliere gli elementi interni che sono in quei testi. Difficilmente quando un testo non ha problemi, fanno quel passo ulteriore, quello che per esempio ha proposto Jean-Luc Fournet con la paleographie signifiante, e che invece per uno che non è abituato come noi a lavorare in diplomatica sono quasi strumenti concettuali abituali. Immediatamente di fronte a un testo come il primo esempio di papiro fatto in 3 parti, io faccio questo lavoro di destrutturazione che mi è normale dal momento che mi sono esercitata sui testi della diplomatica o anche della paleografia delle carte. Non dimentichiamo che la diplomatica, questo sono molto d'accordo con Paul, che ha un côté troppo teorico. La diplomatica che fa ricerca è una paleografia delle carte, perché ha a che fare con la formazione, con la materialità di quei documenti, più che con la struttura giuridica e tutto insieme. Quindi, però in quel caso quegli spazi sono la cesura, la lettura. La lettura era silenziosa, era personale, perché sono documenti della pratica. Quindi andavano in mano a chiunque sapesse scrivere o leggere, e anche ad un soldato che aveva un alfabetismo forse limitato, ma che aveva i suoi documenti a casa, per i suoi diplomi, anche diplomi per lo status di veterano.
Forse perché appunto permette anche una lettura più efficace, più celere al momento di poi
L'occhio, esatto,
per controllare
l'occhio
insomma, appunto queste liste per fare
vede
riferimento.
immediatamente l'esempio con un dito, con un bastoncino, queste liste basta scorrere e uno può generarsi le informazioni che vuole. In questo caso non sono le liste di una società non alfabeta come quella di Jack Goody, ma queste liste complicate permettono delle cose incrociate, di avere delle liste diverse dei disease, delle malattie o dei motivi per cui uno veniva congedato, oppure di tutti gli stipendi, oppure lette in questo modo in un'altra serie, erano veramente geniali. Noi vediamo i loro frammenti nelle copie che un dossier come quello di Serapio ci conserva, o forse come nel nostro papiro, che probabilmente è un rendiconto inviato, ma devo concludere la mia interpretazione, da un ufficio di giudici degli inizi del VI secolo ad un pretore, non so, ad una ufficiale più grande. E quindi trae anche la forma anche dai modelli che replica.
Grazie.
È un mondo che ha un alfabetismo diffuso a tutti i livelli, con i registri linguistici a tutti i livelli. Pensate agli ostraca o alle pissarras visigote, già ancora, credo, ancora fino all'età merovingica ci fosse, noi non abbiamo più nulla perché i papiri non ci sono più, ma insomma fosse diffusa, più diffusa di quanto noi non ci immaginiamo. Anche dal punto di vista linguistico, Michel Bagnard abbia studiato bene i vari registri linguistici, quindi la possibilità di... Scusate il mio italiano, vorrei davvero avere le fiammelle della Pentecoste degli Apostoli per poter parlare tutti insieme una lingua comune.
C'est pratiquement comme ça.
Oui.
Non, non, c'est très bien. Je pense que tu parles un italien très compréhensible. D'ailleurs, on peut continuer en parler en français et en italien, c'est plus facile. S'il y a d'autres questions, on peut poser les questions en français lentement et puis tu peux répondre en italien, il n'y a pas de problème. Moi, j'avais justement une petite remarque, justement, pendant que j'ai la parole. Deux questions en une. La première, c'est dans les papyrus, dans les papyri, on retrouve je vois beaucoup de listes qui sont liées au système militaire ou au système fiscal. Est-ce que ça pourrait expliquer quelle est la part de ces institutions dans la construction des listes, d'une part, et peut-être dans la domination de la liste? Et alors, est-ce que ça veut dire qu'on a perdu des masses colossales de documentation en Occident parce qu'on n'a aucune documentation fiscale et aucune documentation militaire? Ça, c'est une première question.
È verissimo. Nei papiri italiani, in quei 3 frammenti che ho citato, e sono interessanti, nessuno l'ha mai notato, io l'ho notato studiando il mio problema di questo papiro, riportano per 4 o 5 linee probabilmente la copia di rotoli amministrativi o di un ufficio fiscale o del grande proprietario terriero che aveva rotoli con cui erano registrati tutti i tenutari, gli affittuari e le terre. Ed è una pratica che poi viene consegnata e di cui vediamo soltanto pochi esempi, anche già modificati all'Alto Medioevo. Penso ancora quelle grandi pergamene di San Martino di Tours, con quella serie in colonne, sono pubblicate nelle carte latine antiquiores, che in qualche modo hanno forse modificato la prassi, ma in qualche modo c'era, l'hanno vista da qualche parte è venuta fuori, e probabilmente dalla Francia, dalla Gallia o da... perduto moltissimo, ma in questi 3 papiri italiani sono in alcune parti è proprio riportata, abbiamo come delle fotografie di qualcosa che lì è stato copiato, nessuno l'ha mai notato, lo scrivo in un saggio, e abbiamo degli esempi di liste perdute dentro documenti che non sono liste. Uno è un esempio di gesta di protocollo, l'altro un rotolo che contiene la copia di lettere di un grande proprietario terriero con la copia al loro interno di elenchi di affittuari, di terre e che non sono scritti per la prima volta in quel modo, sono proprio ripresi dai rotoli ufficiali che aveva nel suo latifondo, nella sua villa.
Bien, bien. Alors, est-ce qu'il y a d'autres remarques? Sinon, j'en ai juste une toute petite pour terminer. C'est à propos du storogramme. Là, c'est aussi quelque chose de passionnant, hein, le storogramme qui cale les entrées de liste. Est-ce que l'on peut dire qu'il y a une fonction, alors ça me fait un peu penser quelque part aux devises chirographaires aussi par certains côtés, une fonction authentifiante, ou en tout cas quelque chose qui donne une valeur particulière, juridique supplémentaire à ces listes-là. C'est pas de l'authentification au sens diplomatique du terme, mais ça donne une valeur juridique.
È possibile, senz'altro dà un valore particolare perché è un segno importante, però anche questo dipende da quel frammento che noi abbiamo. Allora, di fronte a quel papiro di Vicenza che stiamo studiando, quei 2 segni che avevamo notato rimanevano, io non avevo spiegazioni prima di fare tutto un esame, grazie anche al mio progetto, sui papiri provenienti dall'Egitto. Perché lì ci sono dei casi in cui, e gli stessi papirologi l'hanno sottolineato senza così en passant, in cui questi segni danno la certezza che un testo è finito. Ecco, anche per utilizzare questa congettura avevo bisogno di fare questa comparazione. Senza questo esame io questa congettura sul mio papiro latino non la potevo fare. È certo di buon senso, però è diverso che avere una serie di casi simili in cui usare uno staurogramma significa chiudere una sezione. Poi può avere una chiusura giuridica, non lo so. Torniamo di nuovo alla questione di questa società che ha moltissima scrittura, in cui i documenti sono dappertutto, e non è come nella società alto pieno medievale in cui c'è forse un peso giuridico per alcuni documenti ed altri no. Tuttavia chiudere, così come anche chiudere la propria sottoscrizione, almeno fino al VI-VII secolo, con un segno così significativo come il compendium tau e rho, che significa la croce, stauros, voleva dire dare una dignità formale a quell'elenco, ecco, e una sua autonomia. Ecco, lì io vedo un elenco che posso definire come tipologia di documento in senso written record, non documento in senso diplomatico che sappiamo. Ecco, qui sì. Ma grazie alle attestazioni contemporanee, perché allo stesso stato che ho dai papiri dall'Egitto, io posso dare sostanza a questa mia congettura. Senza rimaneva così. E guardate, non è facile perché nelle edizioni dei papiri e gli stessi lavori dei papirologi questi aspetti non sono considerati.
Sì.
Quindi si deve andare a vederli di nuovo. È una parte del lavoro che insieme alle mie ricercatrici faccio con l'interesse per i simboli grafici, anche però con questa funzione di puntuazione, di abbreviazione, non soltanto simboli grafici nelle sottoscrizioni perché sotto degli analfabeti o di alfabeti molto, o dell'elite degli alfabeti, che usa simboli grafici complessi con la tachigrafia, quelli che poi danno origine al signum recognitionis non nemmeno alla Rush nei precetti merovingi. Sono gli stessi che usano i notai bizantini. Cioè, se vedete la forma è la stessa. Ora sarei veramente ingenua a dire che c'è, però se non la si vede non ci possiamo porre domande nuove anche di fronte a questo patrimonio di oggetti grafici che ci è stato, che viene elaborato poi in qualche modo dopo.
Bien.
Quindi
Merci beaucoup, tante
merci
grazie.
a vous.
Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas d'autres remarques dans la salle? On va peut-être arrêter ici, là, sauf s'il y a une importante demande. Donc, tante grazie, thank you so
Grazie a
much. Merci
voi.
beaucoup.
Grazie.
Merci beaucoup à Antonella pour cette magnifique intervention. Là, je vais terminer en français, ce sera plus facile, hein. On est
Oui,
entre
oui,
nous.
oui.
Donc, merci beaucoup pour cette très belle intervention. Et je pense que tout le monde a trouvé énormément de plaisir à t'écouter et on a appris énormément de choses. La prochaine fois, c'est la prochaine séance du webinaire, c'est le 31 mars. Nous écouterons Nathan Carly qui nous parlera justement des...
Conosco Nathan.
Voilà, qui va nous parler justement des codices miscellanei profanes et chrétiens dans l'Égypte byzantine du 3e au 7e siècle. Donc voilà, on est dans la ligne de ta présentation. Donc c'est magnifique, hein. C'est très bien.
D'être con voi, con Nathan, ma non so se ho lezione. Comunque, se posso, ci sarò anch'io.
Voilà. On essaiera de toute façon de l'enregistrer aussi et de le diffuser. Donc, we'll try to record and broadcast it. We'll see if it's possible. Merci en tout cas, merci beaucoup. Merci Antonella, merci à tout le monde.
Bonne soirée.
Que tout se passe bien.
Piacere vedervi, Nicolà, Emily Mineo da Twitter che conosco terribile. Arrivederci.
Okay. Au revoir, au revoir. Merci, merci Antonella.